Hey there. Thanks for joining us and listening to the Jesus Focus podcast. Here you'll find down-to-earth takes on the big questions everyone asks about God. And these questions get straight answers that don't hide behind dull and confusing theological language. We take questions about God seriously enough to get silly, where appropriate, and try to make this conversational and often very funny. So in today's episode, we'll be exploring the question of whether or not Jesus really existed. If so, what historical proof is out there to prove it? Without further ado, let's begin.
Okay, let's just get super basic. How do we know that Jesus really existed?
Well, his mother thought he sure existed.
Can you be serious for 1 second? We literally just started.
Of course I can be serious.
Alright, then seriously, how do we know Jesus was a real person? It's all so incredibly long ago. How do we know that disciples didn't just make him up?
Actually, that's a very good question, and important too.
Thanks.
The simple answer is that we have first-hand witnesses, and we have gazillions of documents that attest to his actual existence.
You know gazillion is not a real number, right?
I know that. I simply meant there's many documents, but there are literally thousands.
Thousands?
Yes.
But how can we trust those thousands?
The same way we trust any other historical document. Historians are very rigorous that way. They're rigorous on the issue of whether a historical figure was actually born, walked on this earth, and then died.
So wait, historians say he existed, not just theologians, but actual historians?
Absolutely. Jesus was a historical figure. You can debate on what he said, or you can debate on who he was exactly, but you cannot seriously question whether he existed. He did, period.
Would you mind giving me some specifics about that?
Okay. First of all, there's two kinds of historical documents. There's the historical documents of the New Testament, and there are the extra-biblical historical documents. I was going to talk about the extra-biblical documents that refer to Jesus.
Right, okay, for starters, what exactly do you mean when you say the term extra-biblical?
It only means documents that are not from the Bible, like books that are written by the Jewish historian Josephus, for example.
Who was Josephus?
Glad you asked. Josephus was a non-Christian historian who lived in Rome in the 1st century, and he wrote several books. In one of them, called the Antiquities of the Jews, written around AD 94, he refers to Jesus.
An actual ancient historian refers to Jesus?
Yes. Let me quote what he wrote. Now, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it lawful be to call him man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold. These and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct to this day. So there you have it, someone outside the Christian tradition who refers to Jesus as a historical figure.
That is definitely interesting. I have to say I'm surprised. And this is generally accepted as a reliable source of proof?
Absolutely.
Not to digress, but what does the phrase "he was the Christ" mean?
It's just a translation of the Greek word for Messiah, which we'll explore later on.
Okay, but that's just one passage from one document. What else is out there that proves that here's historical evidence that Jesus existed?
Well, first of all, there's more Josephus. In the same book as the one I just quoted, Josephus also mentions James, who was the brother of Jesus. It's in a passage in which Josephus is talking about the Jewish high priest at that time, a man with the singularly unfortunate name of Ananus. Here's the passage. But this younger Ananus, who, as we have told you already, took the high priesthood, was a bold man in his temper, and very insolent. He was also of the sect of the Sadducees, who are very rigid in judging offenders, above all the rest of the Jews, as we have already observed. When therefore Ananus was of this disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned.
Okay, so there is historical evidence for Jesus from sources outside the Bible. I'm genuinely surprised.
But wait, there's more. For example, the historian Tacitus also weighs in. Perhaps you've heard of him.
I did not.
Anyway, in his book called the Annals, written about 112 AD, Tacitus talks about how the Emperor Nero was widely rumored to have been responsible for the burning of Rome. He persecuted the Christians for the fire. Here's the passage. To get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christos, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome.
That's definitely impressive. It's starting to sound like this actually really happened.
That's because it actually did happen. Anyway, there are plenty of other historical references to Jesus and to early Christianity besides what we've looked at so far. You have got to hear about Lucian of Samosata and several others.
I think I'll just take your word for it.
No, you can't. Besides, you don't want to miss the stuff. Lucian of Samosata was very popular in his day. Here's the relevant passage from it. The Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. These misguided creatures start with a general conviction that they're immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. All this they take quite on trust, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property.
Okay, I'll admit that's fairly compelling evidence.
And who can forget the Roman historian Suetonius, whose Life of Claudius is an account of Claudius. So Suetonius wrote a book called Life of Claudius, and it's a historical account of the life of the Roman Emperor Claudius. And in that book, Suetonius makes mention of the Christians. And I quote, Claudius banished from Rome all of the Jews who were continually making disturbances at the instigation of Christos. So here Suetonius is referring to an event that took place in 49 AD, and it's actually mentioned by Luke in the book of Acts. And of course, Christos is another spelling of Christ. They weren't big on spelling in those days.
Is that everything?
No. In another book by Suetonius titled The Lives of the Caesars, Suetonius writes about the burning of Rome and about Nero's persecution of the Christians. The passage in question says, punishment by Nero was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. So we don't know exactly what Suetonius meant by new and mischievous superstition, but he was probably referring to the beliefs of the Christians in general, or maybe just the idea that Jesus rose from the dead.
I'm guessing Suetonius was not a Christian.
That's right. But as you can see, there's lots of evidence from outside the New Testament and from non-Christian sources that all of this actually happened. We can debate about a lot of it, but we can't debate on whether it happened. It did. It's not something that was made up in the Middle Ages.
I hear you.
And I'm not done.
You're kidding.
Sorry. I still haven't mentioned Pliny the Younger. He was a governor of Bithynia, and it was in Asia Minor, which today is known as Turkey. But a letter survives that Pliny wrote to the Roman Emperor Trajan, asking advice on how to deal with the Christians in Bithynia. So Pliny had been killing them all at that point, and it was pretty brutal. He was killing all of the men, women, and children who were Christians. And here's a passage from that letter. The sum and substance of their fault was that they have been accustomed to meet on a fixed day before daylight to sing in turns a hymn to Christ as God, and to bind themselves to a solemn oath to abstain from theft or robbery, and from adultery, perjury, and dishonesty, after which they would separate and then meet again for a common meal. So what Pliny is writing to the emperor is in an official letter around 112 AD, and he mentions in the letter that he had been forcing Christians to curse Christ, which a genuine Christian cannot be induced to do. So it's really awful to think what the early Christians had to suffer at the hands of the Romans. And it's valuable to read what opponents of Christianity said about it, because you're getting the information in truthful form.
That's true. So then are we done with historical quotes?
Not quite. There are many others, but I'll just refer to one more. The one I'll want to quote before is from the writings of Julius Africanus, who wrote around 221 AD. In his writings, he refers to a writer named Thallus, who wrote in 52 AD, about 20 years after Jesus was crucified.
So this is a writer referring to an earlier writer.
Right. We don't have the original manuscripts from Thallus, and Thallus didn't have a blog, but Africanus refers to him. And in one passage, he talks about the darkness that fell at midday when Jesus was crucified. You may remember that the Gospels say that during Jesus' crucifixion, right in the middle of the day, it got really dark. And it's a stunning concept. You would have to wonder, why would they even mention it if it didn't actually happen?
That is a good point.
Besides, it seems obvious that people around the time of Jesus really had experienced it, because we have a record of skeptics trying to figure out what might have caused it. Anyway, here's what Africanus wrote. Thallus, in the third book of his Histories, explains away this darkness as an eclipse of the sun, unreasonably as it seems to me. Unreasonably, of course, because a solar eclipse could not take place at the time of the full moon, and it was at the season of the Paschal full moon that Christ died. So there you have it. Africanus quotes the first century historian Phlegon, who also says, in the time of Tiberius, a full moon, there was a full eclipse of the sun from the 6th hour to the 9th. So people in the early part of the century had actually experienced what the gospel accounts say.
That really is pretty strange.
And they were puzzled about it, trying to explain what had really happened, since most of them didn't believe that it was a miracle. They didn't believe that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah and therefore the Son of God. So they were looking for a natural explanation for what was a very rare and strange phenomenon.
I'm pretty convinced by the historical proof that Jesus actually existed. And earlier I asked, what does the phrase "he was the Christ" mean?
Good question. In the next episode, we will answer that question and explore whether or not Christ was Jesus' last name.